Hi, we continue in Genesis 27 today. After Isaac has provided Jacob the blessing that belongs to Esau, does he believe it's Esau or not? We'll have to test that in the scene today. So, as we've been looking at, if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to watch the introductory video to this entire unit, starting with 2634 to 28:9. We've gone over a number of things there that I'll just touch on briefly here, including that we're continuing in the chiasm you can see here of the entire Jacob cycle. We're nearing the end of this section here, parallel to the chapter 33 deception plan there. And as we've been looking through the key words of the entire section, we're on this section here, and you can see that one of the key words throughout this unit is father. It's not that it hasn't been obvious that Isaac was the father all along, but Esau appealing to father and the narrator saying father how many times, I didn't count them in this paragraph. You can see that's really the emphasis. And it's one of the most poignant passages in all of Genesis, if not in the entire Bible, using the strongest language Hebrew can to convey both Isaac and Esau's dismay at what's happening here. But how much of this is real and how much of it's not, and what is the cause, we're going to have to look at. As we do, we've been going over some of the questionable assumptions that a number of scholars make that can distort the story in a way that prevents us from hearing what's going on. And I've gone over these in detail, but particularly as we come to Isaac and Esau here, there are a couple things that are important. One is that the twins' physical features reflect something of their interior lives. And I noted this last time, that a number of scholars attribute Esau's hairiness, associate Esau's hairiness with his being dull of mind, or being crude, or being primitive, and yet there's nothing in the text to suggest that. In fact, ironically, hunters end up being the founders of civilization, as we saw with Nimrod, and as sociologists and anthropologists show us throughout history, that the most sophisticated means of social organization were done by the people who have control of the most violence. So actually, it might go exactly against the presupposition. But in any event, one is hairy and one is smooth, and that says nothing necessarily about their character. Similarly, the rights of the firstborn are divinely sanctioned, and not only is that not the case, but I've been trying to show that throughout this section, the authors are at least implicitly against the unfairness of both birthright and paternal blessing that suggests there's only one. And we're going to see that today in the incredible language of Esau's cry when he finds out that his father has given, quote unquote, his blessing to his brother Jacob, and it not only can't be reversed, and it can't be redone. But why? Who says so? Yahweh didn't say so. Elohim didn't say so. Scholars tend to assume that there's some ancient cultural norm that's at issue, but there's no evidence provided for it. And if the text is from exile or post-exile in the Persian period, perhaps this is as much about the situation in Babylon and Persia as about some ancient situation in the second millennium. A couple more things we need to go over as we look at this factor, just to have in mind that Isaac is weak as a father, is being manipulated. But as I showed a few videos ago, the evidence is exactly the opposite, that Isaac is a strong father, a strong man. He negotiated a border dispute and dealt with squabbles over wells, and he prayed successfully to God to overcome the barrenness of his wife. And as we know at the beginning of the story, he and Rebekah both found their spirits made bitter by Esau's wives. So my suggestion throughout has been that Isaac is a strong man, and that he and Rebekah are conspiring here to see if Jacob can get through this test and then be sent back successfully to Uncle Laban to get a wife there from the trickster that Rebekah knows her brother Laban is. A couple more things we need to go over briefly. That the human father can convey the Abrahamic blessing. And plainly we saw that that's not the case. That whatever Isaac thinks he's doing, in reality, beneath the ambiguity of the story, he's simply a human being saying words. And they have no power whatsoever, other than to show that the father wishes the best for his son. He's not in any official position, say like a minister who's legally ordained to say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, and that makes it so. But that's not so because of the words. That's so because the institution provides authority that is recognized by a legal system. And here there's nothing like that. There's simply a father and a son and a mother and a brother out there, and these are just words. And yet they cause so much trouble. And that goes to the number 7 here, that the words he conveys have actual power, and they plainly do not. As we've seen, what he conveys is not, in fact, what happens, and we'll see next time what he says to Esau as sort of a consolation unprize is also not what happens. The rest of these we'll look at when we go. So hopefully that clears our head a little bit, and as we look at the comparison here between what Rebekah did in setting up Jacob to bring the food to Isaac, we also see the parallels here with what Esau is doing on his own with no support from his mother. And another thing I want to look at, and I'll bring it up now because we'll see the parallels as we enter more closely into the details of the verse, is the parallels between this scene and the monarchy succession scene in 1 Kings, where Adonijah seeks to succeed David as Esau seeking to succeed Isaac, and is interrupted by the mother of the other son, Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. And we'll see some language in our passage today that almost explicitly evokes that parallel. So let's put our keywords up here and we'll jump right into our passage. And so we see in verse 30, my note below notes the complex pattern of emotions and identification issues from this scene. Let's go over that just briefly. At first, Jacob is the underdog against whom the system is weighted draws our sympathy, as we've seen. But now, after Jacob gets the blessing, it is Isaac and Esau's emotions, which are described in great detail, some of which we'll look at today and some of which we'll look at next time, leading us to side with them as victims. But then later we'll see with Esau pledging vengeance against Jacob, planning to kill him, our sympathy swings back to Jacob. As Walter Brueggemann suggests, who after referring to Jacob's act as diabolical and a function of treachery, he adds, the story is fashioned deliberately to bring our sympathies to those who are beside the point. It is a subtle but deliberate way of saying that the blessing will work in spite of human character and quality and in spite of our inclinations in another direction. But as much as I love and respect Walter Brueggemann, it's not clear from that exactly what human character and quality he's imagining is in spite of. He seemed to be suggesting that it's defects in Jacob's character being a deceiver and Isaac as being weak and Esau as being primitive. But as I've noted, none of those are necessarily the case. So let's look more closely at the language as the scene unfolds. And for the second time, we see the transition is as if choreographed. As soon as Esau went out after verse 4 to go hunt, Rebekah came in and prepared Jacob. Now that made sense because she was listening and waiting for the moment. But here's is something else at issue. And as my note below says, the timing throughout leaves the impression, without ever saying so, that there's manipulation going on. But by Yahweh, the writer, or the parents? In other words, if we see this all as fulfilling, quote unquote, the oracle, then we could say, well, Yahweh's manipulating things to make it come out the way Yahweh wants, and what Yahweh wants is for Jacob to have the blessing and for Jacob to rule over Esau, etc. If we see it as the writer, it might be this manipulation in order for us as readers, as I was just noting, to have our sympathies switched from Jacob as the victim to Esau as the victim. And if it's the parents, we'll see that this is being set up in order to get Esau out of the way first, and now to get Jacob out of the way so that Esau can have the stage, and eventually to have Jacob out of the way by sending him back to the old country. So all those things are happening at the same time. As soon as Isaac finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father Isaac, we need to look more closely at that language. The word for scarcely gone out here, yatso yatsa, it's doubled there as an intensifier, as we saw in verse 13 with the infinitive absolute, the form of Hebrew where the word is repeated twice to raise the tension level. So we could say had scarcely yet scarcely gone out. And that's the word that's doubled here, or scarcely gone out, yes, gone out. From the presence of his father Isaac. And as always, the New RSV, for reasons I can't understand, covers over the Hebrew pene, face, which we saw earlier in the story, back in verse 7, when Rebekah talked about being blessed in the face of Yahweh, etc. And we'll see the face on the other side of the chiasm in chapter 32. But the point of the face, like so many other elements of intimacy, is that this is an intimate gathering. He's face to face, was face to face with his father Isaac, and now Esau is going to be face to face with his father Isaac. So it's more specific than presence, it's face to face. His brother Esau came in from his hunting. That's just a mistake in the scroll here. I can scroll up and down and that'll go away. So, and as we see in verse 31 and 32, almost verbatim, and that's what we see here. He also prepared savory food, and we'll see a number of elements of also, or things like that, to suggest that Esau is just simply too late, that the scene is done and he's come to replicate something that's already taken place. So he also prepared it. Notice he cooks it himself. So to the extent that cooking was women's work and Rebekah did it for Jacob, Esau knows how to cook from whatever animal he's caught. And why couldn't Jacob cook? He cooked the stew. I wonder why he couldn't cook the goat stew. He cooked the lentil stew. He also prepared it and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father sit up." And as I noted in the previous one, sit up is wrong. Yakem means to stand or arise. As we saw in the Jacob's one, it was doubled. Not only said sit up, but it said sit up. I've just left the no RSV here, but it said stand up and sit down, suggesting he's having him sit at the table. Again, so much art that follows the notion that Isaac is giving a deathbed speech and is lying in bed dying, and he needs to be sat up to have something like a last meal. But as I've been noting, he lives for many decades after this scene. So let my father stand up. And as Wenham notes below, one wonders whether Esau's hardiness in fact transgressed Oriental etiquette, and excuse the old-fashioned word Oriental there, or not, as the case may be. Should a son really address his dying father with such gaiety? And again, Wenham misses the math that I showed you earlier, that Isaac is not dying at all. Hoover notes, though, and I like Hoover's more recent work, which takes account of not my view, but views similar to mine, and presenting a range of views about interpreting this story. He says, Esau speaks humbly, while Jacob speaks presumptuously. He further notes a similarity with Isaac's request at verse 25. It seems that Isaac and Esau have an insider language when it comes to giving and receiving food, while Jacob's words are a bit more direct. Perhaps this indicates all the more that Isaac may have known Jacob was before him. Jacob did not use the correct speech patterns when addressing his father. As we noted earlier, in putting the word Yahweh in there, Rebecca put a code word, as Zucker understands it, as a commentator, David Zucker understands this, so that Isaac would know that Rebecca had rehearsed Jacob for the scene. Here we see the opposite, that Esau and Isaac, as the beloved son of the father here, have their own private language that Isaac understands, which leads him to know that this is Esau, even though he obviously knows it's Esau, because if he's in on it, Rebecca, he knew that the one playing Esau was Jacob. The only way he doesn't know this is Esau, if he really is weak and couldn't tell the voice of one son from the other, and couldn't tell the arms of one from goat skin, and couldn't tell his favorite food from goat stew, all of those being very unlikely. So, let my father stand up and eat of his son's game. Notice how he talks about himself in the third person here, not naming himself, or not even saying my. So that you may bless me. And I note that this phrase, we see it twice here, but is used 4 times in our passage. Back in verse 4 from Isaac speaking to Esau. In verse 10 by Rebekah quoting Isaac speaking to Esau, but speaking to Jacob. In verse 19, Jacob speaking as Esau to Isaac. And here, Esau speaking as himself to Isaac. So 4 times each in the mouth of a different character. His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" And what a question is that for Esau to experience? What would Esau imagine is the issue when he goes up to his father with the game that his father sent him out to get? And as Sarna notes below, Isaac does not call the speaker my son because he cannot conceive of the possibility of having been deceived by his own offspring. And of course, that's the case if you follow Sarna, who's following the traditional view that Isaac is the one who's being tricked here. He answered, "I am your firstborn son, Esau." And I won't go back to 23:4 for now, but he uses firstborn as it was at verse 19. So again, exactly echoing this here. Again, the narrator had never used it, and Rebecca didn't use it. The narrator used the language of the great son and the small son, but the 2 brothers use the language of Bekorah here, even though the birthright has never been mentioned directly. And then we see the response, and it's so strong that no English words can really convey it, and we have to look at it carefully, and look at Esau's response in the next verse carefully too. So Isaac trembled violently. Using Vaycherad here, it's only one other time in Genesis. Let's look at it there in 42:28. And here, where the brothers have been tricked by Joseph, interestingly deceived by Joseph, they lost heart and turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" And they believe it's God rather than Joseph. And there's an interesting parallel in that scene, but we'll look at it. We'll look at it when we get there. But the whole phrase here, "trembled a great trembling," is only a couple of other times. It's in Exodus 19:16 at the sound of Yahweh on Mount Sinai. So Isaac's trembling here is as great as the Israelites trembling at the smoke and quaking of the mountain at Mount Sinai. But interestingly, it's also the quaking or the trembling here of the people around Adonijah, who had presumed to put himself as the successor to his father David. And after Bathsheba went to Nathan, David's court prophet, and convinced David that he had promised Solomon the reins, and they celebrate Solomon getting the blessing, if you will, of being the successor, Adonijah and all his guests go trembling their own ways. And so there's a certain parallel there, and we note that that parallel will be similar to what we're looking at throughout as the parallels between the monarchy and this family story, especially since the oracle said there are two nations in your womb. So we'll be looking at that more as we go. So Isaac trembled violently, the powerful trembling here. And we see a couple other examples. I won't belabor all the details. But that leads some scholars to say, see, plainly with this kind of trembling, Isaac must be being fooled. He must be just noticing for the first time that it's Esau. But that's not necessarily the case, and the evidence will come as we continue. So he asked then, who is it then that hunted game and brought it to me? Using the word epho, as in verse 37, we'll see next time, with a certain sense of resignation there, that hunted game and brought it to me. And as my note below says, apparently Isaac was truly fooled, well, that's how he's acting, but it can also be a ploy for Esau's sake, as we'll see in just a minute. So who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and have blessed him? Of course, who else can it be? There's only one other it can be. Yes, and blessed he shall be. As Westermann notes, the father's horror stands powerless before the unalterable. But why is it unalterable? And that's a question that stands remaining. And we'll see, as Esau says in the next verse, bless me also, Father. Why not? Who says there's only one blessing? Why can't a father bless both his sons? Why can't he take it back? Why can't he say to Jacob, if he really was fooled, you tricked me, and I'm not going to, my words to somebody who were sent in deceit don't count. Why are those things not the case? But we never hear, and there's no evidence for why this arbitrary ruling that one blessing only and you can't be undone is the law of the land, and especially given the horror that it leads to here. So yes, and blessed he shall be. Using the doubled verb here for Barak here, but not with the infinitive absolute, but it underscores that Isaac sees, at least what he's reporting, as the irreversible nature of the utterance. And again, we have to wonder, does Isaac really believe it's irreversible, or is that just part of what he and Rebekah are plotting in order to get Esau out of the way and get Jacob back to Laban? And so now we hear Esau's response. And as White notes, Esau's position is not unlike that of Saul after Samuel had taken away the kingship. And there's certainly a parallel there, but as I'm suggesting, it's more closely connected to Adonijah, as I just showed with that parallel word. So when Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. It's as strong as Hebrew language can express, and we need to look at the details of that here. So here it is. Vayitzak Seaka Gedalah Umara et Mayod here. So the first word here makes a pun on Isaac. You can see Vayitzak here. And it's elsewhere in Genesis for Abel's blood crying out from the ground. In 41:55 in the Joseph story for the Egyptians crying out for bread in the famine. So that's what this is parallel to. And the second word, which is also a word for a cry, is only in Genesis otherwise for the outcry against Sodom. It's in the book of Esther for Mordecai's cry. And the word for bitter here it connects with the bitterness that we heard earlier that he had caused in spirit for his parents by marrying the Hittite women. And so much going on there and evoking all these images, both in Isaac's cry of the Exodus and in Esau's cry of Sodom and of Abel and all those kinds of cries. But notice in both those situations, Esau's cry is the voice of the victim, not the perpetrator. He's not on the side of Cain here, who is the shepherd there, or I'm sorry, the farmer there, while Abel was the shepherd. There were no hunters in that situation. But certainly in the Sodom story, we have the violence of the Sodomites, and it's their victims who are crying out. So Esau cries out among the victims of violence here, even though there's no physical violence against him. And he said to his father, bless me also, Father. As Westermann notes, the earnest entreaty grows out of the lament, as later in the Psalms do worship. And here's Isaac's response. And as Westermann notes, but again, I ask questions about it, he says, expresses most forcefully the ancient understanding of blessing as word that acts. One can deceive someone about it and carry it off like an object of prey. But what evidence is there for it? What ancient understanding is he talking about? If it's before the Bible, then where is it from, and why do we have evidence that would be relevant to the culture of a text almost certainly written in the time of Babylonian exile or after, in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era? So don't know what Westermann means by that, and I read all of his volumes. I didn't see any evidence for that. So don't know if there is any. But if you know of some from some other source, feel free to say so. But he said, your brother came deceitfully. And here we hear it explicitly for the first time. It'll only come up again in 34:13 when there's deceit on two of Jacob's sons over the rape of their sister. And we'll see that when we get there on the other side of the chiasm. So, as Hoover notes, Isaac might be protecting himself from Esau by describing the extenuating circumstances by which he blessed Jacob. Isaac could not simply tell Esau that Jacob came and took the blessing. Esau would wonder why Isaac did not recognize Jacob. Instead, Isaac uses the fact of deception, because after all, Jacob did come in deceit as an alibi. And I think that's the best explanation I can get for why Isaac had that powerful feeling. That he's both afraid of Esau's strong response. It might come back against him if Esau finds out that he deliberately gave away Esau's blessing to his brother. And Esau is certainly not likely to believe that Isaac didn't recognize the difference in voice and food and touch, etc. So Isaac has to act like he was completely surprised too, so that Esau doesn't turn his wrath on him. And we note in the next verse, and we'll continue next time, Esau immediately sees Jacob as the problem, and that will set up what I understand is the reason for this whole exercise. And we'll see a little bit more of that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.